Welcome to the Certitude of the Catholic Faith. I'm John Veneri, and we're going through the Catechism of Pope St. Pius X. We had just started on the Creed, and we're going to talk about the first article of the Creed, which is, I believe in God the Father Almighty. I believe in God the Father Almighty. Now, I'm going to save the discussion about God the Father for a later program, especially when we get to the Trinity. Because it'll make more sense if we just approach it at that point. But what I want to look at today is a discussion of God who is Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. And I'm going to be coming from an angle that probably you may not expect. I want to address something that I think all of us have heard. It's in the air right now. I think in school or on television, we hear this, and that is that today we don't really need God, we don't really need religion, we don't need anything because science provides all the answers to everything that we need to know. We don't need God. Empirical science explains everything. And I'm talking about the empirical science, basically the sciences. These are modern sciences. Well, not all that modern, but it is most of the time science operates by observation. We learn about plants by observing them. We learn about animals by observing them. Medical science comes through experimentation and observation. But they're saying the idea is taught today that everything is explained by science. Now, I'm going to show that that's not true, but in the process, this should not be understood that in any way I'm trying to denigrate true science. We all have a tremendous respect for true science. We're all grateful for true science. I love air conditioning, and ultimately I'm sure it was scientists that brought us that. So we're not denigrating true science, but we are going to send out a warning against false science and false principles that come from pompous scientists who are not really fully connected with the truth. Now, why can't we say that science tells us everything? Well, it's not true that the empirical science explain everything because empirical science is actually dependent on the philosophical science of metaphysics. Now, I know that might sound complicated. What's he talking about? So I'll explain by example. Now, if I'm in a lab and I mix potassium permanganate with glycerol, do you know what happens? It explodes. I've never done it, but I've seen video presentations of these scientific presentations. They pour the glycerol in, and it starts to smoke a little bit, and then it starts to smoke a little more, and then it starts to smoke a little more, and then finally, it bursts into flames, and it gets so hot that it actually starts to melt the glass that contains it all. Okay, so this is what it does. This is what it does. It's a slow combustion, but it will explode. Now, what kind of a scientist would I be if I said to you that when you mix potassium permanganate and glycerol, it will explode, and if you mix potassium permanganate and glycerol together, it will not explode? See, what makes it doesn't make any sense, because what makes science possible is the affirmation that, yes, if you mix these two ingredients, they will explode. And also, it negates the opposite. It negates the idea that if you mix them together, they will not explode. So in other words, empirical science is based on what? Much of empirical science, or pretty much all of empirical science, is based on what is called the principle of non-contradiction. The truth that something cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same circumstances. And this is not so scientific, really. Just, your 5-year-old son comes running in and saying, well, Daddy, I want some ice cream. And you point to the freezer in your kitchen and you say, Tommy, the ice cream is in the freezer and the ice cream is not in the freezer. The boy will freeze. He'll just look at you and say, Daddy, what are you talking about? He recognizes the principle of non-contradiction, that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same circumstances. Now here's my point of talking about this. The principle of non-contradiction does not belong to the empirical sciences. It is not taught and demonstrated in biology. It's not taught and demonstrated in zoology. It's not taught and demonstrated in astronomy. No, the principle of non-contradiction is taught and demonstrated in the science of metaphysics, which is one of the philosophical sciences. It is in metaphysics that we discuss the principle of non-contradiction, and it is in metaphysics where this principle is taught, where it is explained, where it is defended. And all empirical sciences base themselves on this principle that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same circumstances. So my point is, okay, empirical sciences say they have the answer to everything, but they don't answer the question, they don't teach, and they don't they don't teach the basic principle of non-contradiction. That does not come from empirical science, that comes from the philosophical sciences. The true philosophical sciences. I'm not talking about what goes on in the modern universities today where you sign up for a philosophy course and you just get a history of philosophy of what everybody taught. I'm talking about I'm talking about the real science of metaphysics. Now another point, when you mix potassium permanganate and glycerol together, you get an explosion. This is ultimately explained not by empirical science, but by the philosophical principle of cause and effect. For every effect, there has to be a cause. It's a given in modern science. This is a given, but the principle, again, does not come from empirical science. It comes from the philosophical science. It comes from metaphysics. It's taught and defended in the philosophical sciences. Now, if you know, and an example of this is on January 28th, 1986, you might remember in the United States we had the space shuttle, the Challenger. It exploded, and all of those astronauts died. It was within minutes of the launch. It exploded. People saw it on television. President Reagan, who was president at the time, he set up a presidential commission to discover the cause of the explosion. He did not set up a presidential commission to discover if there was a cause. No, cause and effect is taken for granted. And the understanding of cause and effect does not originate, as I said, in the empirical science, but it is based on the philosophical science of metaphysics, that every effect has to have a cause. Another principle from metaphysics is that the same cause cannot be the reason of opposites. It's another way of saying the principle of non-contradiction. You're giving advice to somebody about taking care of your clothes, and you say to them, if you put your favorite brightly colored skirt in the washing machine with 2 liters of bleach, it will damage the skirt. And if you put your favorite brightly colored skirt in the washing machine with 2 liters of bleach, it will not damage the skirt. No, that can't be, because the same cause cannot be the reasons of opposites. And this, again, is not something that is taught in the empirical sciences. It is taught in philosophy, especially metaphysics. Now, when we talk about philosophy, what are we talking about? I am saying all this for a reason. You'll see. Philosophy is not just the idea of, well, I have my own philosophy of life, which means it's the way I see things. My general view, my general worldview, that's my philosophy. No, true philosophy is a rigorous science. I'm talking about Thomistic philosophy, scholastic philosophy, that which comes from us from Aristotle and Aquinas, which is hardly ever taught anymore, by the way. It needs to be revived. But true philosophy is a rigorous science, a systematic science that answers what is being. We all exist, but what is existence? That's answered, that's one of the things that are answered in the science of metaphysics. How do we know things? And how do I know that I really know something? How do I know that I know it? That is something that's discussed in the philosophical science of epistemology. What is man? What is intellect? What is free will? This is something that's discussed in the philosophical science of philosophical psychology. And finally, after we learn all this, we know what man is, and then how ought we to act? Is there an objective moral law? Is there a natural law where we study what we should do and what we shouldn't do, and why we should do this and why we should not do that? See, true philosophy gives us the certitude, and it teaches us how to recognize that a given thing is true, why a given thing is true, and why it cannot be otherwise. That's how we really know when we know something. We have to know that it's true, we have to know why it's true, and we have to know why it cannot be otherwise. And once we can answer all those things, then we truly know something, and this is what philosophy gives us. Dr. Feser, he explained the philosophy of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. He defined it as an explicit, systematic account of what we all know implicitly. True philosophy always tallies true philosophy always tallies with and perfects our common sense. So I'm saying all this because in the natural order, we've not even mentioned God yet. In the natural order, we can see it's false to claim that the empirical sciences, astronomy and geology and all these other things, that the sciences give us the answers to all things. They do not, because the sciences, the empirical sciences themselves, do not stand on their own. They are based on the philosophical sciences. And the reason, too, I bring this up is because many, I won't say all, but many of modern scientists even say we have no need for the philosophical sciences, we have no need for metaphysics. And yet they use the principle of metaphysics all the time. The principle of non-contradiction, the principle of sufficient reason. All these things they're constantly using, continuously claiming, all the while claiming that we don't need metaphysics. So that's why it's false on the first principle, on the first point, and that is that empirical sciences do not exist all by themselves. They are based on the philosophical sciences. So falsehood number 2 as to why to believe that science answers everything. Modern science does not adequately answer that simple question, where did we come from? Where does everything come from? Where did the world come from? Where did the entire universe come from? Now, some do attempt an answer, but because many of them are conditioned by their training or determined by their will to reject God, they're not going to bring God into the equation as the source of all being, as the source of where everything comes from. And so some of them, in their insisting that they do not bring God into the equation, they come up with some pretty absurd thesis. A modern so-called philosopher named John Hosper, he basically says that the universe doesn't require an explanation because it's just here. It's a brute fact. Here's what he says. Now, when you hear what he says, it's not going to make sense to you, but I'll read it anyway, then I'll explain it. He says, the universe has such and such laws, and if those are ultimate, we can't derive from any other ones. If we have once arrived at a basic or underived law, then it is self-contradictory to ask for an explanation of it. Okay, what did he say? He actually did say something, but what did he say? He's basically saying that the ultimate laws of the universe, the ultimate laws of the universe are, by definition, ultimate. And since they are ultimate, they require no further explanation. They are self-explanatory. Anthony Flew, another modern philosopher, he pretty much spoke the same way. In the end, though, he became a theist. He accepted God as the source of all things, and this stunned the academic world, his conversion to theism. Another modern writer named Kay Nielsen, he's an atheist, now he's still talking about, well, where does the whole created universe come from? It's here, it had to come from somewhere. Here's what he says: why should we assume or even believe that we actually have such an explanation? So this is science. This is not science. And it's very curious that those scientists who demand a scientific explanation of everything, everything has to have an explanation, in this singular instance, they are willing to say, well, there is no explanation, and we're fine with that. Because it's the ultimate, and the ultimate is self-explanatory, and the universe is just a brute fact. When it comes to where everything comes from, they either have fantastic theories, or, as I said, a brute fact. The celebrated atheist Richard Dawkins, when he was asked, I don't know if anyone saw the DVD documentary Expelled, there's the wonderful scene where Ben Stein asked Richard Dawkins, so where did life on earth come from? We see life. Where did it come from? Because he's denying God. He's denying all these things. And Dawkins says that it very well, now this is a serious answer he gave, it very well may be the case that life was probably originally seeded on earth millions of years ago by aliens. Aliens came down in spaceships and seeded life, and that's where it came from. Now, Dawkins is an Oxford Don. He said this with a straight face, and he's a renowned author. He's quoted by people. He shouldn't be, but he is. And because Dawkins says it, we're supposed to go, Dawkins, Dawkins. We're supposed to just accept it. He says it with this real pomposity. But it is highly unscientific. I'm reminded of the great Catholic writer G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton once heard an outrageous comment said by someone, I mean a really ridiculous comment by someone. And Chesterton turned to his friend and he said, you know something? That statement had to have been made by an intellectual. He said, no normal man could be that stupid. And this is what we have here. No normal man could be that stupid as to give these unscientific answers. It's unscientific, again, to claim that everything we see as a whole, creation itself, the cosmos itself, requires no explanation because it's a brute fact. And it's also unscientific to posit ridiculous theories. There was another scientist in Ben Stein's film Expelled where he postulated that life just came to be spontaneously on the backs of crystals. And when Ben Stein pressed him on that, of course, he couldn't give an answer. So science here, we see science does not answer those basic questions. Where do we come from? And science itself is not the be-all and end-all empirical science because it itself is based on philosophical science. But what do we see? What can we learn then about where we came from? What do we know from ordinary common sense? What do we know? We know that whatever undergoes movement is moved by another. Whatever undergoes movement is moved by another. If you walk into your dining room, and as you're walking into a dining room, you see a soccer ball flying through the air, and it lands and crashes and smashes your favorite vase, you never say, oh, I guess that ball just moved itself. It's a brute fact. The movement is self-explanatory. No, what does mom say? Who did this? Who did this? You know that the ball did not throw itself. Whatever undergoes movement is moved by another. And this is what we see everywhere. We see movement. We see movement. It is a simple fact that everything, we see motion everywhere. And if the motion does not explain itself, something else has to explain it. One of the most obvious examples we can give is the moon. Now, the moon is not a living thing. The moon is an inanimate object, yet the moon is constantly moving. It's orbiting around the Earth. Whatever undergoes movement is moved by another, and if the movement does not explain itself, something has to explain it. Now, you could give a bunch of intermediate causes, gravitational pull, all these other things the scientists say. Yes, these are intermediate causes, like one cue stick attached to another cue stick, pushing another cue stick, pushing another cue stick. But all of those intermediate actions are really one action. They're really one action, and they're still dependent on a first mover. This is the famous first way of Aquinas' proof of the existence of God. Whatever undergoes movement is moved by another, and you can't go to infinite regress of this pushing this, pushing this, pushing this, pushing this. You have to come to a first mover who is not moved by any other, and that first mover is whom we call God. That's a very quick summary of the first way of St. Thomas, that proving God through motion, but just try to prove motion without God. It does not work. And there's a lot more to St. Thomas's explanation. We could give actually a whole course on that, but this is not a philosophy course. But I want to talk about creation itself. I want to talk about creation. This is something we really don't think of, and we need to really ponder it for a little bit. We say in the Creed, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. So what we're going to see is that creation, what is it? Well, what we see when we examine it is creation requires a creator that is almighty. It requires limitless power. It requires infinite power. Now, we seldom think about what the word creation means. And I give a little hat tip to Dr. Dennis Bonnet, who wrote a terrific article on this topic. What does it mean? Now think about it. What does it mean to bring something into creation? What does it mean to bring something into being from nothing? Not bringing something into being from pre-existing matter. Not bringing something into being if you buy some kit and snap it all together. No, to bring something into existence from nothing. Now, to help us understand this, St. Thomas Aquinas lays down the principle. Again, the scholastic terminology you may not understand, but we will give examples to explain it. Aquinas lays down the principle that this is a quote from him, a greater power is required in the agent insofar as the potency is more remote from the act. What is St. Thomas Aquinas talking about? Well, it's actually very simple once I give you some examples. And these are the examples given by Dr. Bonnet. To make a chicken from a pre-existing chicken, okay, chicken from chicken requires a certain amount of power, because the cause, the chicken, and the effect, chicken, are not that remote from each other. They're alike. So it requires a certain amount of power. Now, if you were going to make a chicken, however, from vegetative life, from just plants, from plant life, this would require an even greater amount of power because of the remoteness between vegetative life and chicken. Now, we do know there are similarities. Chicken does have certain things that the vegetable life has. The vegetable life has nutrition, it feeds itself. It has growth, it grows, and it has generation, it reproduces its kind. The chicken has that, but the chicken also has what the vegetable life does not have, which has the 5 senses, the 4 internal senses, self-motion. So because of the greater distance between the two life forms, as it were, it would require a much greater amount of power to make a chicken from vegetable life. Now, we'll take it one step further. Suppose you wanted to make a chicken from mud, from the slime of the earth. That would require an even greater amount of power, because the only thing at this point the cause and the effect have in common is matter, just matter itself, mud and the body of the chicken. But we're going from mud to a live chicken. The amount of power that would require is much greater than a chicken from a chicken. So if we review this again, you have the chicken to the chicken, that requires a certain amount of power. The chicken made from vegetable life, that requires more power. The chicken made from mud requires an even greater amount of power. Then how much power does it take to make a chicken from nothing, from no pre-existing matter whatsoever? It requires an infinite amount of power, because it's not that there is a greater relation between the chicken and the non-being. There is no relation between the chicken and the non-being. It is a relation that can't be measured. It is a relation that has no limit. And because it is measureless, and limitless, then to create a chicken from nothingness requires an infinite power, requires an immeasurable power, requires an almighty power. And since we are all finite, anything that is finite cannot produce something infinite. It requires an infinite being with infinite power. And this is what we call God, and this is why we say, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. Now you'll notice, I've mapped this out for you without quoting the Bible at all. God the Father Almighty, reason itself, human reason itself, can come to the conclusion that the Creator has to be almighty. It has to be an infinite power. Now, Scripture teaches that too, but I remember old Father Marian, he was arguing with an atheist, and he said, look, I'm just asking you to I'll pay attention to you if you do one thing for me. I want you to make a 2-inch blade of grass from nothing. I'm not asking for a handful of sand. I'm not asking for a mountain. I'm not asking for a continent. I'm not asking for a moon. Just make me a single blade of grass from nothing. And then maybe I'll pay attention to you. Because even making that single blade of grass from nothing requires an infinite power. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and we have Scripture telling us, Wisdom chapter 11, thy almighty hand which made the world. So next week we will continue on the Creed, and we will talk more about God as the creator, the other attributes, and also what Scripture and what the councils of the church have to say about God, his almighty power, and his other attributes. We'll see you next time.